October 3rd, 1944. The rain had not stopped for 2 days across the outskirts of Valkenburg, a Dutch town whose narrow lanes and leaning stone buildings had become a bitter seam between British forward elements and a retreating, but not broken, German infantry force. Low clouds pressed against the rooftops, muting every sound except the steady rattle of water dripping from gutters and the distant rhythmic thud of artillery somewhere beyond the river. The men of the 4th Royal Horse Artillery were soaked to the bone, their greatcoats heavy, boots squelching with each step. But every man kept moving. Because the message that reached their column just before dawn held a tone no soldier ignored. A German platoon, 30 to 40 men, had entrenched themselves in the heart of town and were blocking the route to a bridge the British absolutely needed for the next day's advance. Gunner Harold Whitcombe, 27, wiry as fence wire, and known for the sharpest eye in his battery, trudged behind the others with a shell crate balanced on his shoulder. For most of the war, he had fired his 25-pounder from open fields, hedgerows, and muddy farm tracks. He was used to distance, to the clean geometry of elevation and azimuth. Urban fighting was something else entirely, fickle, shifting targets, pockets of Germans, civilians hiding in basements, and this mission wasn't the job of a field gun section at all. It was supposed to be handled by infantry already in Valkenburg, but they had run into a problem. The Germans had taken up a nearly invisible position among the old stone heart of town, one so defensible that every British patrol sent in came back limping, shaken, or didn't come back at all. Harold felt the knot in his stomach tighten as they pushed deeper into the outskirts, the streets narrowing between crooked houses whose windows were shuttered and dark. Rain pooled in the grooves of the ancient cobblestones, turning puddles into mirrors that reflected the flickering lanterns used by the scouts ahead. And then he saw it. The chapel, rising at the far end of the street like an old, weather-beaten sentinel. St. Aldegonde's Chapel, the local name for it. Its stone walls were mottled with moss, and the bell tower loomed above the town square, the cross still crooked atop its spire after a shell had clipped it earlier in the summer. A captain from the reconnaissance unit met them at the door of a baker's shop that had been turned into a temporary command post. He swept water from his cap brim and leaned close so only the gunners could hear him. "The bastards have dug into a row of houses opposite the chapel," he said quietly. "They've got interlocking fire across the square. Anyone steps foot between the fountain and the shoemaker's lane, bang, sniped or cut down by an MG-42. They're disciplined. Not kids, these ones." The infantry had tried to flank. They'd tried smoke. They'd even tried slipping men across rooftops. Nothing worked. And without shifting them, the British couldn't secure the bridge that connected Valkenburg to the main highway. The Germans knew it. They had chosen their ground perfectly. "So what do you want from us?" Harold Sargent asked, rubbing his cold hands together. The captain's eyes drifted toward the chapel bell tower. "Elevation," he said simply. "A vantage point they won't expect. If we can get a man with a spotter's eye up there, he can direct fire from a couple of Brens and maybe mark where we should drop rifle grenades. The loft should be high enough to see past the square's blind corners." The sergeant snorted. "You mean send someone up into that tower while they're shooting the square to bits?" "Yes," the captain replied. "And that someone needs to be someone who sees things other men don't." Every man in the group looked at Harold. He had never imagined fighting from a church tower. It felt like stepping into a painting from the Middle Ages, where archers waited in stone lofts for invading armies. But when the sergeant clapped him hard on the shoulder and said, "Grab your kit, Whitcombe, let's give them hell from above," he only nodded, though the weight of the moment pressed deeply on his chest. They moved at dusk, when the last light strained through the clouds and turned the chapel's stained windows into dull amber panes. Brittle leaves blew through the courtyard as Harold slipped inside the dark nave. The chapel smelled of wet stone and old hymn books, the faint scent of incense lingering like memory. Thunder cracked somewhere overhead, not storm thunder, but artillery bouncing off the hills. Harold's boots echoed in the empty chapel as he crossed to the narrow wooden ladder leading up into the bell tower. The sergeant waited below while Harold climbed, each rung slick with moisture. Rain drummed on the tower's slate roof, and the wind seeped through the cracks as he ascended into the loft. The bell, massive and tarnished with time, hung suspended by thick beams. Its clapper rested silently. The loft was cramped, cold, and smelled faintly of guano from the pigeons that once roosted there, but had fled when the shelling started. Harold ducked under one beam, crouched beside a narrow arched window, and allowed himself to exhale. Then he looked down. The view was extraordinary, an entire slice of Valkenburg unveiled. The square below was deserted, except for the broken fountain and an overturned pushcart. Beyond it, Harold saw the problem instantly. The Germans were dug in behind 3 shop fronts whose wooden facades created shadows deep enough to hide men with rifles. A machine gun nest sat tucked in the corner where a butcher's shop met an alleyway. Another pair of soldiers moved in and out of a doorway, every step calculated. They were confident. They believed no one could see them clearly from British lines. Harold wiped rain from his brow and raised his binoculars. A sharp thrill of fear cut through him as he spotted one German adjusting the MG-42. If that thing opened up again, it would ruin any British attempt to advance. He tapped the bell beam nervously, listening to the hollow sound ring through the loft. It steadied him. He unpacked his rifle, his Lee Enfield No. 4, and braced it across the stone ledge. Normally, a gunner's place wasn't in a marksman's hide, but war was strange, and sometimes the man who spent years calculating trajectories and windage understood better than anyone how to factor rain, height, and angle into a shot. A flare burst somewhere behind him, casting the streets in a harsh, white glow. Harold leaned closer to the window, heart pounding. The Germans stiffened, clearly alerted to the British movement. One stepped forward into the open, scanning the square. Harold followed the man's outline through his sights, feeling the stillness of the loft, the cold seep through his bones. He had to wait. He had to breathe. The rain slowed for a brief moment, as if the entire town held its breath. Harold fired. The crack of the rifle was swallowed into the storm. The German jerked and dropped instantly, collapsing backward into the doorway he'd just stepped out of. The MG-42 crew flinched, unaware of where the shot had come from. Harold ducked back behind the stone frame, heart racing as he worked the bolt, the familiar metallic click grounding him. He peered again. The MG team scrambled, dragging the weapon deeper into cover. Harold steadied himself, adjusted for the angle, calculated the arc his shot needed to slip just under the awning. He fired again. Sparks kicked off the metal frame of the nest, and one German tumbled sideways, clutching his shoulder. Harold's sergeant whispered urgently from below, shouting to supporting infantry, "Whitcombe's got their heads down! Move! Move!" British troops dashed between walls, using the seconds Harold bought them to cross into better positions. Rifle grenades were prepped. A Bren team sprinted behind a market stall. Harold fired a third time, hitting a shadowy figure who attempted to crawl toward the MG-42. Then he saw movement at the second shop front, a pair of Germans trying to outflank the British by slipping into the alley. Harold pivoted, braced, exhaled. Another shot cracked. One man fell. The other froze, panicked, searching upward, but unable to see Harold silhouetted against the beams of the loft. Rain fell again in sheets, masking Harold's location. He wiped his sight, breath fogging the glass. Below, the Bren opened up, stitching a line of fire across the cobblestones. British rifle grenades followed, slamming into the far wall and blowing a shutter apart. The Germans broke into scattered shapes, confused, pinned, scrambling for any cover not exposed to the unseen shooter above. Harold kept firing until he counted only 2 rounds left in his magazine. The loft vibrated slightly as the wind surged. The bell, enormous and cold, quivered on its beam beside him. He reloaded mechanically, fingers numb, and pressed back to the window. He could see the desperation in the Germans now. Their earlier discipline had broken into frantic movement. One tried to dash out toward the fountain. Harold put a shot into the stone just behind him, sending chips flying. The man dove back into cover. The British advance picked up speed. The sergeant barked orders. A section manoeuvred to cut off the remaining Germans from the rear. The machine gun nest was now silent, its operators unconscious or retreating deeper indoors. Harold took one final shot into the doorframe where he'd last seen movement. More to pressure than to kill. The Germans decided the position was impossible to hold. Panic rippled through what remained of the platoon. They withdrew in chaotic clusters, abandoning the wounded, leaving weapons scattered. Some tried to escape through the alley. British troops intercepted them. Others dropped rifles and raised their hands. Within 15 minutes, the square that had resisted British passage for nearly 2 days was completely in Allied hands. But Harold wasn't finished. He scanned one last time, ensuring no hidden riflemen were lying in wait. Only then did he climb back down the narrow wooden ladder, legs trembling, palms raw from gripping wet wood. When he stepped into the chapel nave, the sergeant met him with a stunned expression. "Jesus Christ, Whitcombe," he muttered. "You just broke an entire platoon from a bloody bell loft." Harold swallowed, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was, but he only said, "They picked the wrong angle. Height changes everything." And outside, for the first time that day, the heavy rain eased into a soft mist. Harold didn't sleep that night. None of the men did, not properly. The square was finally quiet, the German platoon broken and scattered, but the town still held an unease that seeped into every shadow and doorway. The chapel bell loft had given the British a sudden and decisive advantage, but the German retreat was not a clean one. Prisoners taken by the infantry spoke of another group, an auxiliary detachment somewhere deeper in Valkenburg, tasked with holding the bridge approach at dawn. If the British pushed across the river too late or too slowly, those reinforcements could turn the entire victory into a stalled mess of street-by-street combat. And so the orders came down just after midnight. Every unit involved in the advance was to reposition, rearm, and prepare to move at first light. Harold barely had time to remove his soaked jacket before another runner appeared at the chapel door, breathless, asking for the marksman from the bell tower. Harold blinked with exhaustion, exchanged a confused glance with his sergeant, and followed the young soldier out into the rain-slicked courtyard. The captain from reconnaissance stood under the chapel awning with a map case tucked beneath his arm. Lantern light cast deep lines across his face. "Gunner Whitcombe," he said quietly, "you may have just saved the advance, but we need you again." He tapped the map with 2 fingers. "Not from the loft this time, something worse." Harold felt his shoulders sag. "Worse?" He didn't ask yet. He let the officer continue. "The Germans didn't just retreat. They fell back to a secondary rally point, the rectory behind the old monastery grounds. We believe they've dug into the cloister walkways, tunnels, cellars, old stone storage rooms. The place is a maze, and they're using it well." Harold stared at the rain puddling at his boots. He could hear the distant clatter of a Bren gun being cleaned, the murmur of soldiers prepping gear. Everything was moving, shifting, tense again. The captain waited a beat before saying the sentence that made Harold's stomach drop. "We need eyes on the monastery courtyard. No one can get close. Snipers, tripwire, broken masonry everywhere." "But there's another high point." Harold exhaled sharply. "Another loft?" "Of a sort," the captain replied. "A broken belfry in the monastery's west tower, but it's half collapsed. Only one man can go up safely." Harold rubbed his hands over his face. "I'm not a bloody angel perched on rooftops. I fire guns on wheels." "Tonight," the captain murmured. "You're something else entirely." They moved before dawn, slipping through the torn edges of Valkenburg's alleys, while the sky was still bruised with the last of the night's rain. The monastery grounds lay on the western rise, a hulking stone structure that had once housed monks for centuries. Now its cloisters were riddled with bullet holes, doors smashed open, stones cracked by shell fire. The smell of damp earth and old plaster mixed with the sharp bitterness of cordite. The infantry scouts led the way, their boots whispering through the long grass. Harold walked behind them, carrying only his rifle, binoculars, and a pouch of ammunition. His heart thudded in his chest, not from fear of heights, but from the weight of responsibility. His shots from the chapel loft had stunned the Germans, but this was something much more dangerous. He wouldn't just be spotting. He'd be the first, and maybe only, set of eyes on a hidden enemy stronghold. The west tower appeared as they rounded the monastery's crumbling wall. In the half-light, it resembled a wounded giant, its top shattered by a previous bombardment, its stones fractured, its ladder likely warped by water. The British infantry formed a perimeter around the tower base, keeping watch for any sign of movement in the shadows. The sergeant stepped beside Harold. "If the tower goes down," he muttered, "you'll be buried in hymn books and centuries-old dust." Harold tried to smile, but couldn't manage more than a tight grimace. "Let's just hope the monks built it better than the chapel." The climb was harder this time, every rung flexing beneath his weight as he ascended the narrow shaft. He could hear the creak of stressed wood, the faint groan of stone shifting. Dust drifted in thin sheets through beams of pale morning light. His breath grew louder in the confined space. He felt sweat bead despite the cold. When he finally reached the broken loft, he had to pull himself onto a slanted plank using raw strength. The belfry no longer had a bell. It had been blown loose months earlier. Only the iron brace remained, twisted like a snapped rib. Harold crouched too, careful not to shift his weight too suddenly. The entire structure trembled as if listening. He crawled the last few feet to a jagged opening where half the wall had collapsed outward. The view beyond was a ghostly courtyard filled with mist. Archways lined the perimeter, each one offering shadowed cover where Germans could hide unseen. In the far corner, a small group of soldiers in field grey uniforms moved between broken pillars, unaware they were being watched from above. Harold raised his binoculars. His breath caught. There were more of them than the prisoners had admitted. Far more. Not a handful. Not even a platoon. Nearly 50 men, maybe more, using the monastery's network of underground rooms as a defensive node. They were shifting crates, setting firing positions, dragging debris to create improvised barricades. And deeper in the courtyard, Harold spotted something that made his stomach twist. A mortar team assembling their weapon with calm, practiced motions. If that mortar fired at the British advance point near the bridge road, dozens of Allied soldiers would die before breakfast. Harold lowered the binoculars slowly, steadying himself on the splintered floorboards. The tower swayed again in the wind, reminding him how precarious his position was. He chambered a round in his rifle. The first shot snapped across the courtyard, striking the mortar assistant just as he hoisted a tube of shells. The man fell sideways, dropping the crate, shells clattering across the stones. Panic rippled through the courtyard. Soldiers dove behind pillars, others scrambled towards subterranean entrances. The second man at the mortar rushed to grab the tube. Harold fired again, hitting the stone inches above him. Chips exploded around the German's face. He scrambled backward, slipping into cover. Harold kept firing, forcing them to abandon the mortar entirely. Below, the courtyard churned with confusion. A dozen Germans pointed their rifles skyward, but couldn't locate him. The mist, the height, the fractured tower's shape made his silhouette nearly invisible. Bullets whipped past the gap in the wall, some striking the tower stones with sparks, others punching through the cracked wood behind him. The belfry shook with each impact. Harold pressed back, breath tight, then leaned forward again, methodically scanning for priority targets. Radio men, runners, officers. He spotted one soldier shouting orders from behind a fallen statue. Harold's shot hit the stone beside him, spraying white fragments. The man ducked, shouting for smoke grenades. Thick grey smoke blossomed along the courtyard, curling up into the arches. It made Harold's angles harder, but not impossible. He aimed for legs moving through the haze, shadows shifting too quickly, rifles appearing in silhouettes. He fired twice, heard screams echo through the cloisters. Then, through the drifting smoke, he saw them, two Germans dragging the mortar tube toward a cellar door. If they got that weapon underground, they'd reposition it and start firing on the British from a protected angle. Harold steadied himself. The wind rattled the broken rafters. His heartbeat hammered in his ears. He took the shot. The bullet struck the first man in the thigh, sending him collapsing into the mud. The second dropped the tube and sprinted for cover, but Harold was already adjusting, calculating his trajectory. He squeezed the trigger once more. The man fell into the doorway, blocking it with his body. Below, the British infantry had begun advancing along the monastery's outer wall, using the chaos Harold created to close the gap. Harold could hear the sergeant's distant voice shouting commands. The Germans were split between returning fire upward and dealing with the British pushing around the perimeter. Harold reloaded, his hands trembling. The tower groaned again. The Germans were shooting at the structure itself now. Bullets smashed into support beams, knocking dust into Harold's eyes. One strike hit the floor so close, he felt the wood tremble beneath his knee. He forced himself not to retreat. Not yet. He leaned back out through the jagged opening. He saw a cluster of Germans forming near the central well, 5, maybe 6, trying to regroup and counterattack the British infantry pressing in from the southern cloister. Harold exhaled. 3 shots. 3 collapses. 2 survivors diving into the open archways for cover. The courtyard spiraled faster into confusion. Shouting, smoke, scrambling boots. German discipline shattered again, breaking into scattered motion. Then the tower lurched. A beam somewhere beneath Harold splintered under sustained rifle fire. He threw his weight down, bracing himself as the platform dipped several inches. Stones clattered down the outer wall. He could feel the structure's death throes vibrating through his legs. But he wasn't leaving. Not while any German still had a chance to regroup. He took 2 more shots at fleeing figures, hitting one cleanly. The other stumbled but escaped into a cellar passage. British troops flooded into the east cloister now, firing controlled bursts, grenades bouncing under archways. The Germans were cornered on 3 sides. Their retreat to the north door was cut off, their mortar disabled, their communication lines in disarray. Harold forced himself upright, crawling backward toward the ladder shaft. As he reached it, he took one final look through the loft's broken opening. The courtyard, moments ago an organized defensive node, was now dissolving into surrender. Men tossed rifles aside. Others waved white scraps of cloth. A few still resisted, firing blind shots before being overwhelmed by the infantry. Harold began descending carefully, every rung creaking. He expected the tower to shear sideways at any moment, but fate was merciful. When he finally reached the ground and stumbled into the monastery's outer hall, the sergeant seized him by the shoulders. "You mad bastard," the sergeant muttered, half scolding, half awestruck. "You just gutted their entire position from a pile of rubble." Harold didn't answer. He couldn't. His chest heaved, hands trembling uncontrollably. He simply sagged into the nearest wall and slid down until he was sitting on the cold stone floor. The tower stood behind him, wounded but upright, as if waiting for permission to collapse now that its purpose was served. The sun finally broke through the clouds by the time the monastery grounds were declared secure. Thin beams of light filtered through the shattered arches and across the courtyard stones where British infantry moved methodically, checking cellars, pulling prisoners from hiding places, and tending to the wounded from both sides. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, disrupted masonry, and the acrid sting of gunpowder. Harold sat on a fallen beam near the outer cloister, his rifle across his lap, his breath still unsteady from the long descent out of the collapsing tower. His uniform was covered in dust, and dried mud streaked across his knees where he had braced himself to shoot. The sergeant tossed him a canteen. "Drink before you fall apart," he said gruffly. Harold obeyed. The water was metallic, lukewarm, but it steadied the shaking in his hands. Around him, soldiers moved with subdued voices, their fatigue plain on their faces. The success of the monastery assault was spreading through the ranks, but so was the knowledge that the day was far from over. Any moment now, the push toward the bridge would begin, and every surviving German in this area would do everything possible to prevent a British crossing. The captain approached, his boots caked with mud. He crouched beside Harold, maps rustling in his hand. "Gunner Whitcombe, you've done your part," he said. "More than enough, truth be told. But we're not done. You need to hear what happens next." Harold nodded silently, his fingers tightening around the canteen. The Germans fell back from Valkenburg's heart, but they're forming a last defensive belt around the bridge road. We have reports of machine guns being dug into the embankment. Panzerfaust teams setting up behind collapsed wagons, snipers along the rooftops parallel to the river. The captain lifted his eyes. "They're expecting us, and after what you did to the platoon in the square and to their rally at the monastery, they'll be on edge." Harold exhaled slowly. "And what do you need from me now?" The captain turned the map around so Harold could see it. His finger tapped a point slightly southwest of the bridge. "This rise here, old farm terraces. Abandoned millhouse at the top. If you can get eyes from its upper window, you'll see their entire line. Snipers, MG nests, Panzerfaust teams, everything." He tapped again. "If we can mark them before our boys advance, we can suppress them instead of taking casualties crossing ground they're watching." The sergeant scowled. "Are you planning to put Whitcombe in every bloody high spot in Holland?" The captain didn't flinch. "If he can see them, they break. That's what we need today." Harold closed his eyes. His body screamed for rest. His knees ached from kneeling on splintered wood. His ears rang from rifle fire and collapsing stone. But he knew the truth of these operations. Sometimes one pair of eyes could save dozens of lives. And after what he'd already done, from the chapel loft to the shattered monastery belfry, he had become something he never expected. The one man whose angle, whose calm under height and pressure, was uniquely suited to cracking entrenched positions. He opened his eyes and nodded. "When do we move?" "Now," the captain said softly. The trek to the millhouse took over an hour, weaving through narrow lanes, skirting the edges of ruined gardens, and following a shallow ridge through the farm terraces. The sky brightened steadily, the clouds thinning until the first warm sunlight in days bathed the fields in a pale glow. Harold felt the warmth on his face, even through the exhaustion. It was a strange comfort in a morning filled with tension. The millhouse appeared through the trees, a squat stone structure with a sagging roof, its water wheel long since rotten to pieces. Weeds grew between the mill's stones, and the upper window shutters hung at odd angles. A small group of British infantry cleared the ground floor quickly, finding only dust, spiders, and a few abandoned tools. The building was empty. Harold slung his rifle across his shoulder and climbed the creaking staircase, each step groaning under his weight. His muscles burned from the earlier climb and descent, but he pushed on. The upper window faced the river bend, allowing a sweeping view over the gentle slope leading toward the bridge road. He reached the window, pulled aside the crooked shutter, and inhaled sharply. From this height, the German defensive line unfolded like a grim tableau. One MG-42 nest sat behind a broken wagon at the edge of the road. Another was dug into a shallow depression near a stand of trees. Harold spotted Panzerfaust teams concealed behind rubble piles, snipers perched in two of the remaining rooftop corners, and at least 20 infantry dug in behind sandbags or overturned carts. It was the most fortified line he had seen in days. He raised his binoculars, studying each position. Small details stood out. The glint of a barrel, the slight shift of a helmet, the muddy scrape where a soldier had recently repositioned. He memorized each location, building a mental map of their entire network of fire. Below him, the British infantry waited behind a low stone wall, Bren gunners ready, riflemen crouched in lines, mortar teams poised. The captain waited for Harold's signal. Harold steadied himself, set his rifle atop the windowsill, and began firing. The first shot hit the wagon's rear axle, startling the MG team behind it. They ducked reflexively. Harold shifted and fired again, the round striking inches from the barrel. The weapon jerked. One operator tumbled back in shock. A ripple passed through the German lines. Fear, recognition, sudden uncertainty. They didn't know where the shots were coming from. All they heard was the invisible punctuation of a rifle cutting into their positions with surgical precision. Harold fired on a Panzerfaust team attempting to reposition. The rocket tube clattered to the ground. Another soldier dragged his wounded comrade away from the line of fire. The MG nest near the trees opened up blindly, spraying the hillside. Bullets tore into the millhouse roof, shattering tiles, but Harold stayed low and calm, adjusting angle after angle. One sniper appeared for a split second on a rooftop. Harold's shot forced him back down. A second sniper tried to spot him from a chimney. Harold placed a round exactly where the man's arm had jutted out. A yelp echoed across the river. With each shot, he wasn't just killing, he was shaping the battlefield. Every suppressed nest gave the British Bren teams a window to move. Every pinned soldier let the infantry advance 10 more meters. Every sniper forced into hiding loosened the Germans' control over the field. Harold saw British troops breaking from cover, rushing tree to tree, gaining ground. Mortars thumped behind him, their rounds whistling overhead before slamming into the German positions. Clouds of dirt erupted along the embankment, scattering defenders. But the Germans, desperate and furious, now concentrated their fire on the millhouse. Bullets hammered the upper wall. Plaster exploded into dust. One round punched through the window frame, grazing Harold's cheek and drawing a thin line of blood. He flinched, but didn't fall back. He could not. Not yet. He fired again, hitting a soldier sprinting to reinforce the wagon. Then he targeted the depression near the trees, sending rounds into the earth around the MG team until they abandoned the nest entirely. The millhouse shook under a fresh volley. One beam above him cracked. Dust rained over his shoulders. Harold felt the floorboards sag slightly. A chill ran through his spine. It could collapse like the monastery tower. But if he left now, the British would lose their sight line, lose their surgical suppression, lose the momentum his fire had created. He chambered another round and fired through the shattered shutter, striking a rooftop sniper squarely in the helmet rim. The man dropped behind the ledge, motionless. Below, the British surged across the remaining stretch of field, their momentum irresistible now. Grenades arced through the air, exploding behind the wagon. German soldiers stumbled from the smoke, dazed and disoriented. Harold fired twice more, sealing their retreat. Then the British infantry hit the line like a hammer. Shouts, clashing rifles, close-quarters chaos unfolded near the embankment. Panzerfausts were kicked aside, rifles knocked from hands, men wrestled into surrender. The German defence collapsed under the combined fire and shock of the British assault. Harold lowered his rifle slowly, his entire body trembling from exhaustion. The millhouse was quiet again except for the creaking of the roof and the distant cheers of infantry celebrating a hard-won breakthrough. He let his forehead rest against the windowsill. For the first time since yesterday morning, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything. The chapel loft, the monastery belfry, the millhouse window. 3 vantage points. 3 impossible angles. 3 lines of defence broken, not by brute force, but by patience, clarity, and the calm of a gunner who understood trajectories not just of shells, but of moments. Footsteps pounded up the millhouse stairs. The sergeant burst into the upper room, panting. "It's done, Harold. Bridge is ours. They're falling back across the river." Harold managed a faint, tired smile. "Good," he whispered. "About time I got off a roof." The sergeant barked a laugh and hauled him to his feet. As they descended the staircase together, the millhouse groaned again, as if relieved to finally rest. Outside, the British troops were forming up, preparing to move across the bridge for the next phase of the advance. Harold stepped into the sunlight, blinking, his uniform dusty, his cheeks still bleeding, but alive. The breeze carried the smell of the river, the sound of boots on stone, the murmured gratitude of soldiers who knew what his marksmanship had spared them. And though no medal would ever mention the chapel bell loft, the fractured monastery tower, or the sagging millhouse window, the men of the battalion would never forget the gunner who climbed where no one else dared, who saw what no one else could, and who crippled not just a German platoon, but every defensive line they built that day.